Alright everyone, now we have to talk about the Supreme Court decision on the EPA case the other day, of course, West Virginia versus the EPA, I believe, and it regards emissions standards being set by the EPA. And I live reacted to it, live stream yesterday, of course. It's a good decision, great for fighting NIMBYism, but it is a narrow decision. The specific language that was used by the court invites its use potentially in future litigation. I'll get into that. That's the good side. But it didn't really heavily restrict the EPA at all. It only pertains to one particular thing they wish to do. It doesn't knock it out of the park as I hoped that they would do. I didn't expect it, but I did hope for it, that the EPA largely lacked any regulatory authority not explicitly given to it. However, what this does is it creates one little chink in the armor, so to speak, of the federal bureaucracy. The EPA cannot unilaterally design a new rule that wasn't explicitly implemented. Even though only one particular rule out of many, probably thousands of them, the EPA is unconstitutionally enforcing, is actually named in the case, which forces you to have further litigation, you can use that as a standard for the rest of the EPA rules. Did Congress specifically incept them with that in mind? Was there legislation, because Congress has to authorize the powers of the bureaucracy, did Congress specifically allocate to them a certain power, or is it something that they're assuming is implied under their mandate, but they can't really find any explicit language to show that they have the power? This opens the floodgates against other EPA rules. It could also be used as a precedent for the rest of the alphabet soup agencies, and this is wonderful. I think that will be a very, very slow trickling. It'll take years and years of litigation. You got to understand, lower courts will have their say first. Some people won't take it before SCOTUS, and SCOTUS can always refuse to take up a case. They only have so much time in a particular judicial year, and so they're limited in what they can actually grant a hearing and then make a potential opinion on. This is a good indicator that at least in some cases that will go forward on the fighting bureaucracy level. It's the only way that you're going to be able to do it. Think about all of the rules that you have to deal with that were not specifically passed by Congress at all. It was simply that Congress authorized a bureau, gave it wide-reaching implicit powers, and now they've gone forth and done the thing. It's probably half the bureaucratic rules in the country that you have to suffer under. And by the way, I will point something else out. A lot of times, Americans are very fond of blaming the president singularly or the court system for their suffering. While Biden is definitely responsible for a lot of suffering, it takes many, many millions of people to tango. Really, your suffering is generally the result, lockdowns, of state action, state laws and or gubernatorial actions authorized under emergency powers, etc., or bureaucracy, including rules that you have to abide by legally that aren't even passed by Congress. They're simply granted under a bureaucratic mandate. One really good thing about this is that it puts also a dent in NIMBYism. To be clear, if you believe that climate change, in the anthropogenic sense, is a risk, is an issue, it'll destroy the world, it'll make it less hospitable, Florida will disappear, whatever, it'll cause more hurricanes, etc., none of the proposals generally put forth by the EPA, by the Paris Climate Accords, by DC, by Moscow, by London, most of it is horseshit. If you believe that to be the case, and the politicians did, they wouldn't have waterfront chateaus like the Obamas do. They would not be, they'd be out planting trees. They'd be saying, shit, I've got offspring too. We're all in the world together, and I don't care if these poor people die, but my kids will end up being suffering. Within 10 years, the world will be in like Tatooine or Hoth or something. And they would go out and plant trees. They'd be liquidating their fortunes to reforest things and try to convince people to, readapt their lifestyles to a post-materialism world. I've also pointed out, if you believe in man-made climate change, and you believe that it's a risk, and you believe there's no natural feedback mechanism to account for it, I don't believe in any three of these things. I think that man's activity contributes to temperature changes. Certainly, we terraformed large swaths of the earth. I think the fact that we've cleared off a bunch of forest for farms probably does more than the coal power plant does, actually. We have done that. I do not see it as a risk. I think a rise in CO2 gets reabsorbed by plant life, which will eventually grow somewhat faster. There's more energy in the system available. Warmer temperatures, I think, are better than colder temperatures. Unless you want billions of people to starve, it'd be a really, really difficult world if we hit another ice age like Leonard Nimoy thought that we would back in the 1970s. Now, that'd be funny now, wouldn't it? We'd have to regress to Neanderthal behavior, and the world population would plummet, and there'd be massive suffering and famines and plagues and all manner of other terrible things if that happens. So enjoy the warmth. Enjoy your very brief reprieve as we very slowly do slide towards another ice age if you look at actual long-term historical data over the course of tens of thousands of years. And I believe there's probably a feedback mechanism because the world has been demonstrably warmer and more carboniferous before, and yet it didn't turn into Tatooine, though the life is still there. It's relatively temperate at the moment. It's hospitable. Again, an ice age would be worse. But most of the green notions are NIMBY. It's not in my backyard. Let's look at the emission standards. Let's say that the EPA massively ups emission standards for power plants, which was, I believe, specifically in play here, cars and stuff, factories. You drive some of these things out of business. You spend more money on them. It raises prices, ergo people have less to spend, they buy less demand, harms your domestic economy. Overall, though, the supply is the same. But the demand is the same. That doesn't get changed by the regulation. The supply, though, is not being made as much in the U.S. because the factory can't do as much because it has more stringent control standards. The power plant is throttled more. The supply of things is now less, but the demand's still there. What ends up happening? NIMBYism. Another factory goes up in China. More fuel comes from Russia, etc., etc., etc. Or good old all-American diesel and coal. I saw a funny picture the other day of a car charging station hooked up to a diesel generator. Many such cases, that is where a lot of that electricity comes from. It's not going to come from the main grid. They're already overstretched as it is, and if 1 million people were to get EVs today, it'd collapse the U.S. power grid system. And the SCOTUS EPA decision knocks NIMBYism for a loop. The emissions standards being set will not stop the emissions from existing. It will just shift them from the United States to some other country where their factories are less regulated. And that's most of the developing world. China, India, etc. Pollution controls are very lax. The power plant, the car plant, literally anything that you can make is going to make less pollution overall if it's built in a developed nation where there's better technology and more controls already, more regulation, literally, than if it's built in China. There, if you pay someone a crate full of cash, or at this point, a bowl of rice probably, you can get around any regulatory standards. You can beat your workers, you can slurry toxic chemicals together and dump them in the river. Nobody really cares. China is embarking right now on a grand propaganda campaign to convince people that they're becoming environmentally friendly by de-desertification, putting up screens of hay in the sands where there used to be grass and trying to get grass to grow, planting a bunch of trees that some of them will die of drought at some point, I'm sure. More parks and carbon scrubbing skyscrapers and stuff. And look, we reduced the smog in Beijing by 5% over the last year. Aren't we just so nifty? But it's propaganda. They're building coal power plants basically on a weekly basis. And that's the result of Western NIMBYism. They've absorbed all the industry that the U.S. government has destroyed here. It's horseshit. The new emission standards were ruled unconstitutional. If Congress really feels that this is a big, big problem, they would be better off. They're wasting their time by even reauthorizing this explicitly to give the EPA this power. What they should do is they should go and plant a tree or sell off one of the limos in their fleet. Maybe they should do what British politicians do and bike to work. I don't see them doing that. Mostly they have SUVs. That's about all. Peace out.